Hello and welcome. I am Dr. Angela Griffin. I have been waiting for quite some time and preparing for this particular moment to speak to you and parents and coaches and athletes about the importance of psychological skills training, which will be the focus of my presentation today. I'm really excited, but before we get started, I'll tell you a little about myself. So I'm actually not just someone who received their doctorate degree and don't know a whole lot about psychological skills, but I actually lived it. I actually am a first-time most valuable player of women's professional football. I played in 2002 all the way up until 2005. I received also a full women's basketball scholarship to Wayne State University. And I was always curious as to the importance of the mental aspect of the game. And I was always curious as to how certain athletes become great, receiving the same training, but some go on to become great. And as I began to do my dissertation and look further into it, I realized that 9 out of 10 Olympic athletes use psychological skills training, but it's not necessarily used in a lot of youth sports. And so that tweaked and sparked my interest to do further research. So most people understand the importance of psychological skills training. They understand the importance of the mental side of the game, but they don't teach it to their young athletes as rigorously as they do the physical aspect of the game. So for an example, I was taking my daughter to a particular, she had a private workout. And as I began to see all these parents surround their kids, watching them learn how create skills to increase their vertical, get stronger, I asked these random parents, the importance of mental skills training. And they all looked at me with this blank stare. And I was like, well, we know it's important, but neither of them invested in time and energy to really get their kids into or strengthening their mental performance. And then there's that myth that one of the parents said, well, actually, my kid isn't that bad. They don't really need it that bad. And so here we have that myth that the mental skills training is only for athletes that have issues or trouble with sports or sports performance. That's one aspect. But mental skills training is for every athlete to strengthen the strongest and improve those areas that we are weak in. And so hence the importance of what I'm going to talk about today is mental skills training. So historically, mental skills training, there was little known about it up until around 1965, and there were a few pioneers who kind of paved the way. And one notable pioneer was Pierre Coubertin. He developed the first sports psychology congress in 1894, so that's quite a ways away. And so he began to understand the critical development of the field of sports psychology and the interest in having athletes maintain self-control during performance in high stressful situations. He further noted that the critical role of the mental aspect of the game really included a balance or a synthesis between the mind and the body and its influence on how athletes regulate their emotions during performance. And despite how physically fit athletes are, there are some components to the mental skills part that even the less physically fit athlete can outweigh the more physically fit athlete. And so I'm going to switch slides here. So as you can see, I've played a few sports. So there's pictures of me. And it was really such an awesome time playing professional sports and really having a really keen understanding of the mental side of playing women's professional football because this was never done before. I've had many drop passes and had to understand how can I move past that as a wide receiver and as a safety when I let someone go past me. How can I get back into the performance where I can still perform at such a high level? And so here, through my research, I really began to understand the synthesis between the mental health component as well as the physical component. And when you marry those two together, they become extremely powerful. So for me, I am also a licensed clinical social worker, but I also have a doctorate degree in psychology. So I have the best of both worlds, where I actually assess for pathology in athletes as well as improving sports performance. So here you'll learn about the meaning and the benefits of psychological skills training. You'll begin to understand the mental aspect of psychological skills training or sports performance. And you'll learn different tools to help athletes with their mental game and the benefits of working with a performance psychologist. All right, so let's talk a little about performance anxiety. While it varies for every athlete and every individual, some athletes get really pumped up during competition. And that's due to a rush of adrenaline, and other athletes may interpret that rush of adrenaline as anxiety. And then the negative thoughts began to take over, which will interfere with their ability to perform. And so we know that most coaches and parents and athletes, they understand and learn how to manage symptoms of anxiety during competition. We understand it's crucial, the relationship between anxiety and athletic performance. However, the distortion of the perception of those adrenaline and the thoughts actually will interfere with the performance of the athlete. And we understand that even when the body is tense, the movements of athletes are less coordinated, and this is due to anxiety. And with anxiety, there comes a lot of physiological signs and symptoms. And I really kind of want to just get a foundation of understanding why certain athletes may freeze up and why other athletes may continue to press on under pressure. And while we understand that there's a certain level of physical arousal, which is helpful and prepares us for competition, the physical symptoms of anxiety can be so great, they become distorted and may seriously interfere with the athlete's ability to compete. And albeit there are certain amounts of worry that can help, but the negative thought patterns that proceed over and over and over again with the expectations of failure can spiral down into your performance as an athlete. And then this athlete particularly gets very frustrated and then freeze when they're out there on the court and cannot perform at the level in which they used to perform. So one of the things we have to understand is, what is this athlete thinking about, right? So everything starts with a thought. So here's that foundation that I'll get you from a mental health perspective. And for every thought that an athlete has, or an individual in general has, there's a corresponding chemical response to that emotion. If the thought is distorted or negative, then it releases cortisol or adrenaline, and it puts your body into the purest form of fight or flight. And in that response, you'll have a lot of physiological symptoms: sweaty palms, you'll have heart racing, they'll get shakiness, nervousness. Why is that? It's because the oxygen is being taken from certain parts of the body and given to other parts of the body in order to prepare the body for whatever particular threat. So any sense of cortisol or adrenaline tells the body that there is something going on, there's a threat. And with that, the body is preparing itself for this particular threat. So this is why most athletes, when they get out there on the field or on the court, they freeze up. And one of the things, what happened is, one of the things that is affected at this point in time is the amygdala, right? So the amygdala is kind of the hub of our emotions, and it is responsible for our fight or flight, and it is the main response to the anxiety that an athlete experiences. And it happens in such a short moment. It happens in less than 10 minutes when an athlete begin to feel this anxiety. And a lot of these negative thoughts, such as anger, such as worry, fear, guilt, anxiousness, all of those are negative thoughts. And as the athletes began to think on these negative thoughts, it began to alert the amygdala that there is something wrong, and the amygdala begins to prepare the body for safety. And so one of the things that I work with a lot of my athletes on is just recognizing what are they thinking about prior to a game, during the game, and after the game. And so for every thought that they have, they are actually building memories. And so most athletes, if you notice, when they get into this funk where they can't perform at a high level. And so an athlete may miss a free throw at, he's at the free throw line, score is tied, he misses. Right then he begins to experience some worry or anxiety or even embarrassment. And all those are negative chemicals. And so the mind takes a snapshot of that more intense emotion. And so anything that resembles that moment, the mind will remind itself, and then the body will follow. The mind and the body are intricately connected, and the body has no mind of its own, and it takes cues from the mind. So anytime an athlete is there at the free throw line, or that particular athlete that missed that free throw that particular time, the moment they get back into that situation, they recall that moment. It's almost like post-traumatic stress disorder. I work for the Department of Veteran Affairs, so I work with a lot of veterans that has the post-traumatic stress disorder. And so because that memory is so intense, the amygdala is now activated, and it will begin to mimic those same physiological symptoms. And so the hands get very sweaty to a point where they can't even hold the ball, and to a point where their limbs are weakened. And so at this point in time, their perceptual field is very narrow. And so it's difficult for them to think and focus and process information that's coming in. So as you can see, this is extremely important for athletes to begin to regulate their emotions, because the absence of that will result into this fight or freeze. And oftentimes they began to engage in a lot of safety behaviors, right? So if you're a volleyball player and you're a setter, some of those safety behaviors would be, as long as I yelled for help instead of going for the ball, then my coach won't pull me out of the game. Right? And so oftentimes they stop, or they won't perform at a high level, or they'll take it easy because they're afraid to make mistakes and get pulled out of the game. And these are called those safety behaviors that they engage in. And then there have been some athletes, particularly that engage in other safety behaviors, such as drinking alcohol for numbing the pain or not wanting to feel anything during that moment. So I had some videos here. I'm not quite sure if it will play, but one of the things that I wanted to look at is really have you focus on training the ultimate athlete. I saw this quote and I thought it was extremely well written. And it says, everyone is born with a potential, but the responsibility in releasing the potential lies within the individual. And as a coach, we have the responsibility in helping young athletes learn how to release and maximize their potential so that they can enrich the lives of others and maximize performance in every area of their lives. That was actually from me, but the quote from below says, a seed, until it is released, is only a promise of a tree, which means that you can have an athlete with so much potential, but unless they tap into both sides of performance, the physical and the mental, they're only limited in doing certain things. And during my research, during my dissertation, I fell across the psychological skills training, because again, I wanted to find out how can certain athletes become great in their chosen sport, whereas other athletes really still struggle. And so one of that is psychological skills training, right? Which involves the application of certain skills, the 4 primary skills, to help athletes regulate their psychological states to have a higher chance of performing at an optimal level. Now, these skills can be used outside of the context of sports as well as within sports. And so one of the things we look at is Weinberg and Gold really define psychological skills, which is a consistent and systematic and deliberate practice of mental or psychological skills for the purpose of enhancing performance, increasing enjoyment, or achieving greater sport and physical activity and self-satisfaction. So psychological skills training, again, is most frequently used by 9 out of 10 Olympic and elite athletes as a way of reducing stress and anxiety by helping to regulate emotions and provide athletes with the tools to perform at a peak level. And there's a lot of studies that found positive results with elite athletes who employed psychological skills training. One of the things I found was interesting is despite the effectiveness and the use of psychological skills training, it is so underutilized in collegiate and youth sports. And that's where my passion comes in because I have 2 daughters that are in youth sports, one in volleyball and another in gymnastics. And as I talk to coaches about the benefits of employing psychological skills training as a performance enhancement tool, they often fail to implement these skills during training and competition, mainly because of lack of knowledge or understanding of how to apply these skills with their athletes. During my dissertation, I interviewed a group of coaches just to ascertain exactly how do you work with athletes, how do you employ these skills, how do you help these athletes use these skills. And these were coaches that had athletes between the ages of 12 and 18. And a lot of them didn't have an understanding, mainly because of the cognitive ability of some of the athletes, of how to actually teach their athletes psychological skills training. One of the things that we have to remember is for the National Association for Sports and Physical Education, Standard 27 explicitly states that coaches should incorporate mental skills training at all age levels to increase learning and performance as part of the athletic holistic the athlete's holistic development. They are to provide mental skills training through a periodized model that allows athletes to progress in developing these skills and peak at appropriate times during the season. And it further states that sports coaches can help athletes develop a mental competition plan that includes pre-competition preparation, a contingency plan for errors during competition, and managing stress and anxiety. So even the National Association for Sports and Physical Education really stresses the importance for coaches to incorporate and employ psychological skills training as part of their practice. One of the researchers that I research quite often is Veely, and one of the things that she stressed as well is that these skills should be a part of your daily regimen during practice. And as we get further into the presentation, I will demonstrate how can we do that. I've worked with some gymnasts, I've worked with some Major League Baseball players and basketball players, as well as golf players, and really began to implement these into their sports performance. And the benefit that you see is their ability to regulate and control when they get frustrated, that they're not so easily dysregulated, that they're able to realize and think more effectively and change or tutor some of that behavior to perform at a more effective level. So while it's not necessarily a requirement, it is highly recommended for these skills to be incorporated into the sports performance. And so as we look at psychological skills training, 4 of the primary skills, we'll go through them. One of them is goal setting. Another one is self-talk. A third one is imagery. And the last one is relaxation. And those are your 4 primary skills that are used mostly by these elite and Olympic athletes. However, as a mental health practitioner, I have also incorporated various other skills such as emotional regulation, distress tolerance, and various other skills to help athletes with their performance to balance and synthesize that energy that they're feeling during a competitive game, particularly at nationals, or a championship game, or when they're going for a bid and they must win this particular match. And so we're going to look at these different phases of psychological skills training and how these different phases are broken down into, as you notice, my business is called Fourth Quarter Performance Consultants. And so I broke it down into 4 quarters. And so the first quarter is your introduction to psychological skills training. The second quarter really talks about the educational phase of each of these skills. Then we look at the acquisition phase, and then we look at the practice phase. And that's where I'm going to be taking you through each one of those phases. All right, so first is the introduction phase. And we see here, I'm sorry, go back. The first one is the introduction phase. All right, so during this phase, I work with athletes in building rapport, right? So at this point in time, I am meeting with the parents, I'm meeting with the child, and I'm meeting with the parents and the child together to kind of work on what is the issue, what are we looking at? Am I looking at pathology, meaning that am I looking at more than just performance anxiety? Is this true mental health, or am I looking at anxiety with regards to just performance? The other thing that I'm looking at during this particular time is I'm looking to see how parents can help me with understanding the learning style of their kids. Parents know that better than I would, and better than athletes sometimes themselves. But like my daughter's a gymnast, she's more kinesthetic. She likes to learn better with movement. And so for most other athletes, my daughter who plays volleyball, she's hands-on and oftentimes have to be shown things several times over in order for the skills to be downloaded, right? So that's one of the things that I do during that particular time in my introduction phase. In working with the athlete, just kind of understanding, building that rapport, and working on a plan. And oftentimes I have different questionnaires, like the mental performance questionnaire. How well do they understand psychological skills? And if the coaches are present, I would like to meet with the coaches as well, just to kind of have an understanding of these, of how the athlete is performing during practices. And the next part of that is the educational phase. And so because a lot of athletes and parents and sometimes coaches are not as familiar or knowledgeable about the different parts of mental skills training and how it works, I spend a lot of time covering this section. And in this phase, it's usually in the context of a group and sometimes individual. Right now I'm working with various individuals, but a lot of the gymnasts that I work with, they were in a group setting. And that's just kind of a way to enable athletes to recognize and acknowledge the importance of acquiring these skills and to see that they are not alone when they have these particular performance anxiety. This phase allows me to help athletes view the mental side of sports performance. And this is usually done, it can be done in either 1 or 2 sessions between 1 to 3 hours. And so normally I break it down because the attention span of some of our youth, particularly after school or after practice, is very limited. So there are times when I will break it down into 1 session. So this second quarter of the education phase can go between 1 to 2 weeks. And it really just depends on how many athletes in a group session or even the individual athlete that I'm working with. Some really download the information a lot faster than others, and some may take a little bit more time. And during this time, I specifically try to tailor these skills for each athlete. And at this point, I'm doing a needs assessment and to find out what skills do these athletes find more important. Some may really cater to the imagery, and some may cater to the goal setting. So during this time, I'm really kind of ascertaining from all the athletes as well as the parents, like, how do your athlete work best? Do they do well with imagery? Are they good with self-talk? And then we began to understand and apply a specifically tailored program for that particular athlete. And so this time, some of the athletes are not even aware of what they actually enjoy. And so during this phase, most athletes began to really verbalize how much they enjoy the imagery or the instructional self-talk. So I usually during this time also reinforce how anxiety affects their ability to perform by understanding the biology behind our thought process, is kind of what I shared with you earlier. And so I often break down how the neurotransmitters are affected each time they have a negative thought, and how much that negative thought can cause them to freeze up on the court and not perform at their ultimate level. So that's phase 2. And phase 3 is the acquisition phase. So at this point, I've learned a lot about our athletes. And at this point, we focus on strategies and techniques for learning the different types of skills and how to tailor it for that particular athlete. Right? So at this point in time, these skills are usually either individually or in a group setting. And at this point, we are learning various strategies, cope ahead skills, we're learning deep breathing skills, we're learning skills such as progressive muscle relaxation or acronym PMR or rhythmic breathing. So I'm introducing some various skills. I'm also working with imagery, teaching them how to use and incorporate imagery by incorporating all their 5 senses. I'm giving them an understanding of instructional self-talk versus motivational self-talk, right? So in this part, I'm really breaking down the skills so that each athlete can begin to work on them outside of their natural setting, which is either, whatever sport that they're playing. And in this phase, it can last between 2 to 4 weeks. And usually for about an hour, I'm working with each athlete at a time. So that's why it usually lasts between 2 to 4 weeks, because it takes a while to break down each skill for each athlete. And the other thing I try to do is really tailor this to different age groups. And so you may have a group of 13-year-olds, and so the skills will be tailored for those particular 13-year-olds. And then the next one is the 4th quarter. So this is that practice phase, right? So this is where I actually come and I observe the athletes in their natural setting to see if they're actually employing some of these skills that we've worked on outside of, the gym or outside of, football or basketball practice. How are they employing it? And usually at this point in time, I'm working with the coaches to reinforce some of the things that they've been working on. For example, if I'm working with a coach on an athlete on imagery, then I will be working with the coach during that session to kind of reinforce the use of imagery during that practice setting. So this is how we go from phase 1 to phase 4 and incorporating those particular skills. And at this point, the athlete has identified and incorporated their desired skills as they move through these particular phases. And so let's talk about the different skills. And one of the first skills that we work on is imagery or visualization and or mental rehearsal. Some of them are used, these terms are used synonymously, but they are pretty different. Imagery is a popular type of mental rehearsal. And this term encompasses a variety of mental techniques that athletes employ, such as observation and self-talk. And so mental rehearsal or imagery are not synonymously, but imagery falls into the category of mental rehearsal. So although they're similar, they fall into the same category, they're very different. With imagery, you're incorporating all your 5 senses. With visualization, you're actually visualizing the image that is placed in front of you. And then in mental rehearsal, you're actually meditating on what you're visualizing over and over. All right. So I have this video going, but I'm not going to be able to play it here. So I'll just read. And most of you are familiar with Michael Jordan. He's one of the most famous basketball players. But one of the things that he talked about was being able to visualize what might happen during performance. So he really embraced the use of imagery and or visualization, which is something that he did before, after, and during his competitions. And as you see here, he says with visualization, things tend to slow down. And so he's already experienced them in his mind. And so that's one of the things with imagery is that it actually incorporates those same motor networks. The same motor networks light up when they are incorporated, when you incorporate imagery, those same motor movements light up as if you're actually doing the physical training. And so 1 minute of mental skills training is equal to 7 minutes of a physical workout. So imagery is extremely powerful. And I know that there was a study a while back with basketball players. They had a study where you had certain players shooting basketball, and you had certain players who imagined themselves shooting basketball. And when they brought them together, the athletes, the basketball players that actually imagined shooting their free throws made more free throws than those who were actually physically shooting the free throw. And the takeback of that is, the takeaway from that is they were able to incorporate both mind and body, whereas those that were actually physically shooting were only actually incorporating their physical body. And so hence the power of imagery, which is something that I really, really enjoy. It is a cognitive process fundamental to motor learning and performance. And when you consciously internally represent an action through imagery, the same brain areas involved in the unconscious planning and execution of memory movements are activated. So those same motor movements are activated. All right, so here's a model that's used, Pel-tip model. This was something that was developed by Holmes and Collins in 2001, the seminal work. This is a very useful acronym that is used to help athletes incorporate imagery. And so I often kind of lend to this model as well. And so usually during this moment, I help athletes incorporate what are the physical movements that you're actually seeing. What is the environment that you're taking into, right? We learn about what emotion are you feeling at that moment, and various other things. And so with imagery, we understand, as I said before, the prefrontal cortex is an area of the brain found in the frontal lobe, and this region plays an extremely important aspect of incorporating imagery. And it's responsible for emotional regulation, regulating your attention, interpreting emotions, and initiating voluntary and conscious behavior. And so the ability for athletes to process information using various senses to recreate or duplicate post or previous behaviors is very important. So oftentimes, even with my children, I have them review some of their performances and look at it and critique it, and then I have them imagine making those corrections. And these are the things that I work with the coaches and the parents on as well. All right, so the next skill is goal setting, right? So goal setting is another component of psychological skills training. Is designed to improve performance and provide awareness and reduce anxiety. This is one of the most beneficial constructs in psychological skills training used to increase the motivation and performance of athletes. And as a focal point for strategic development, it's also used by athletes to be able to attain and to attain realistic and measurable goals. So a goal can be categorized into two types, objective and subjective. And so the general statements such as I want to do my best or I want to have fun, those are some examples of subjective goals. But these types of goals are undefined undefinable, and the outcomes cannot be measured. So it's important to work with your athletes to define and be more specific with their goals. And one of the things that I use is the SMART goal system. And so the SMART goal system is something that I use. It's an acronym: S for specific, measurable, attainable, timely, right? And so those are some things that we look at. One of the things that I do follow in ensuring that I'm working with the athletes and their parents is we want to be able to set guidelines for following or for setting effective goals. Set goals for performances, not outcomes. So we work on just performance goals and not the outcome goal. We set goals for practice as well as for competition. We prioritize and only focus on one or two goals at any given time. Sometimes if you have too many goals, you lose focus and you can get more frustrated if you're not able to accomplish all those goals at once. The other thing is be specific. That's the first part of that SMART goal system. The next one is make sure that your goals are measurable. And then you want to challenge yourself every day to make sure that you've accomplished those goals. And you want to set deadlines and checkpoints for those goals. So maybe after 3 weeks, you can look back and see how far you've come from the time that you set that first goal. You want to write them down and you want to leave them in a place where they can be seen. And you want to share these goals with your coaches, your parents, your teammates, and anyone that can help you achieve them. And this is part of that way of me helping coaches. So one of the things that I've done with some of the gymnast coaches is I had them write down and work with their athletes to write down what goals do they think they should accomplish on the beam versus on the vault versus the floor routine or even the bars. And so each gymnast had to write down the goals that they wanted to accomplish before competition season. And so every coach was responsible for helping to reinforce that goal as well as their accountability partner. So I had them, get another teammate to help them maintain their accountability. So a lot of the gymnasts were able to reach their goals and found it very helpful. And still some of them are working on some of those long-term goals, which is getting to a particular level by doing certain skills that they have to master. And so that's one of the things that we do with some of the coaches and working with them to help reinforce those goals. All right. And so these are the different type of goals that we work on. Focus on the action, the process goals. Maybe hitting 50 balls a day in your chosen sport. Performance goal is making sure your footwork or making sure you're transitioning correctly, increasing your speed and getting to the ball if you're a setter, right? So these are some things that we work on and we have the athletes outline. The other one are outcome goals, and those are usually something like, I want to win the championship or I want to win the game or the match. But it's the process and performance goal that are going to work hand in hand in order to accomplish that outcome goal. All right, so the SMART goal system, of course, be specific, be clear about what you want to happen. So this is specific. Not specific is I want to get better on my serves. Where more specific is I want to improve my serves by 20% every game, or for every 10 serves, I will serve to zone 5, 8 times. And that way, they are actually able to focus on that particular goal and improve that, which actually helps improve their confidence and their self-esteem. We want to make sure that it is also measurable, right? So we want to make sure that we are helping our kids identify goals that are measurable. So not measurable is I want to be a better hitter. That's not something that you can measure, but you can measure I want to get 8 or more kills for every set, or I will hit to the 10-foot line 10 out of 15 times in practice and in competitions. So those are the things that you want to set for maybe some of your outside hitters or your right side hitters. So you want to have them focus on something specific or hitting to a certain spot so many times versus I just want to be a better hitter. And sometimes I will have the athletes grade their performance. Like, hey, what did you, if you know, you killed it at the 10-foot line, but what would you give it? Would you give it an A? Would you give it a D? Or would you give it an E? So sometimes I have them rate it on a scale or grade it. And that's very helpful because it's like a report card. So they're able to see at every performance how they've rated their goals. And then the other one is action oriented. So we want to make sure that those goals make your goal a behavior, something that they can do that someone else could observe, right? So action oriented, I want to improve my hitting skills. Not action oriented. In action oriented, I will practice various hitting styles for an extra 15 minutes after practice or at home, right? So these are different things that you can work with your athletes, and these are things that I work with the coaches in helping them to incorporate during practice. And of course, we want to make sure that the goals are realistic versus I want to win a championship or I want to win every game in 2 sets, right? And then last, we want to make sure that the goals are timely, right? So I want to get better at passing versus I want to increase my chances of getting to the ball to the intended target by maintaining a low position while in the process of passing. So your goals should have a timeline to follow and checkpoints to evaluate. And oftentimes we break these down from long-term to several short-term goals. Right. So the next skill we're talking about is self-talk. And so self-talk is one of those steady stream of thoughts that is internal dialogue that goes on in a player's mind. And it does impact your mood and your emotions. I remember my daughter was having a hard time performing one day, and she was just having a hard time hitting. And I asked her, I said, you know, what are you thinking about? Because remember, everything starts with a thought. And she mentioned to me, she said, well, you know, I thought about, man, I don't want to miss again, or he's going to pull me out the game. So I need to get better. And I said, okay. And she said, so that's positive. I said, no, that's negative self-talk. So really kind of helping them understand, are they using positive self-talk versus negative self-talk? And a lot of athletes actually think they're using positive self-talk versus negative self-talk, right? And so again, the structure of the self-talk can range from a single cue word, which is head, or more specific, get there, right? So those are some things that they can say to themselves, or transition, or arm up, or elbow up, right? Or follow through. So those are those cue words that we have certain athletes use to help them focus. And we also incorporate that with imagery. And so we also set that as a goal, right? So you got to have your elbow up 10 out of 15 times when you're hitting. So those are the kinds of things to help improve the performance of the athletes. And in turn, a lot of your athletes' confidence will improve. And so one of the things, because I am a mental health professional, I often look at what are the activating events? What are the triggers? What is causing these athletes to think negatively? And what is causing these athletes to have some poor performance at times and then good performance where they're inconsistent? And so one of the things that we look at is the activating event. And so one of those things could be your team is defending against a former championship. So that's the trigger. And so they can either have positive thoughts or a negative thought, right? And so the negative thought is they are too good to beat. And then a positive thought could be, I'm prepared well for this month, for this moment. And even though it is a pressure-packed moment, I am confident that I will make big plays. And in turn, that will create a particular behavior. So I use a lot of cognitive behavioral models with my athletes because I understand the importance of how thought affects behavior. Because the moment you say they're too big, they're too good to beat, that comes with an emotion as well as a judgment. And that emotion is going to determine how you play out there on that court. Versus I prepared well and I am prepared for this match regardless. I'm going to make some big plays. That is going to carry another emotion, and it will also determine how an athlete's perform out there on the court or on the field. All right. And so with, let me look to the next slide. All right. So with the negative emotion comes stress and anxiety. And with the positive emotion comes challenges and excitement. And so those are the emotional consequences. And this is how I break it down to our athletes so that they can understand based on your thought and based on your self-talk, this is what's going to happen. And as we can remember from the beginning of the slide, we talked about stress and anxiety and how the amygdala gets activated, and then it will cause a lot of these physiological signs and symptoms to occur, which hinders our ability to process information and to have more fluid movement. And so one of the consequences for the athletes could be disruptive behavior, such as feeling tense, poor concentration, and a slow reaction. Versus the healthy thought will have constructive behavior, such as being focused and confident and able to really pick up and react to the ball a lot more quickly. And so I will oftentimes give them a self-talk log just to kind of help them understand what are your predominant emotions when you have a particular thought, and help them understand what are your predominant emotions when you have a negative thought. And then I help them use cognitive reframing, which is looking at it in a different lens. So how can we look at this competition or this championship game or getting this bid? How can we look at it differently versus in a more stressful way? And so when we try to help them with self-talk, we really help them become aware of their current talk patterns. As I indicated in my daughter, she thought she was using positive self-talk and it was actually negative self-talk. And so oftentimes I'll have them use imagery recall, where I'll have them close their eyes and think about a competition that they played very well. And I'll have them write down some specific thoughts they've had during that competition to help them become successful. And then I have them do the same thing for poor performance and what thoughts they had about that. And I have them compare the list and identify both positive and negative patterns that have affected their performance. And that's where the self-talk log comes in at. And then I help the parents. This is some things that I work with the parents and the coaches on, the do's and don'ts of self-talk. What should they do before practice or competition, the do's and don'ts? What should they do or be saying during practice or competitions, and post competition or practice? What are they saying afterwards? And so these are some things that performance isn't just during a competition, it's actually before and after your competition or your practice. And so we all know that the famous Muhammad Ali, he was the greatest at positive self-talk, and he said that to himself quite often. And the imagery vision down below is, you can see yourself bigger than your opponent. And so positive self-talk really builds confidence. It improves your attitude. It helps you cope with stress, and it just helps with your overall performance. And so this is extremely powerful skill that needs to be incorporated during practices and or competition and outside of practice. And so the next one I work with coaches and parents as well as athletes on is relaxation and energization. And so what is that, right? So it's time when you've been so tense and so anxious that it prevented you from becoming from performing at your best, right? And so one of the things that we try to help athletes do is to relax in those moments. And so there are times when an athlete is just like, I don't feel like playing today. I don't feel like practicing today. I'm really tired. I've had 6 games. And so this is where they really need that extra boost of energy, right? And so this is where energization comes in. Energization allows you to speed up your heart rate and respiration, and it stimulates the blood flow to your muscles, and it enhances the brain activity so that you get more out of practice and competition, right? So this is when you really need to help pump your athletes up. Some athletes use music to help with this. They use positive self-talk. Some of them use a positive reinforcement, such as some motivational videos that they may watch. These are different things that we can employ. Particularly music has found to be extremely helpful. When I worked with a volleyball team last year, one of the things we did was play music when we found the kids kind of lacking in practice and not performing high. And we put on some music, and the whole team just really energized themselves, and they began to practice at a much higher level. And so energization is the opposite of relaxation and involves the activation of the body for optimal performance. And so these are some things that we work with as well. And relaxation is something that a lot of our elite athletes incorporate into their practices. And one of the things they do is they tap into mindfulness, which is a little different from relaxation. But relaxation is kind of one of those things where we allow the anxiety level to become, to reduce the anxiety level so that we can incorporate all our senses, and we take in a lot more information versus being stressed where your perceptual field is so narrow that you're only zoned in on that particular event or that situation. And in this sense, it's usually the threat or what is sensed or perceived to be the threat. All right, so meditation is one thing that I often incorporate in my practice for athletes, is the ability for them to chew over, reflect deeply on a particular subject. So this is where sometimes I will have the athletes just constantly replay a particular part of their game situation that they became very successful in, and just replay it over and over and over again so that they become more sensitive to it versus desensitized to it. And so this is where you really the meditation involves incorporating your whole being. And so oftentimes when they're watching their videos, I'll ask them what emotions are they feeling in that moment. And so I'll ask them to describe some of the physiological symptoms that they're experiencing as well. And so this helps me to determine where do we go in our next phase. If they're still feeling anxiety, then we need to do some possible cope ahead skills or other mental health skills that I've incorporated into their performance, maybe some distress tolerance skills that we need to incorporate. And so mindfulness is something that's where you are aware in the present moment and accepting things as they are without judgment. So this is something that I incorporate with every athlete. And this is something that oftentimes during our sessions, either group or individual, that I will do a mindfulness exercise with them to help them stay in that present moment with me, because they've been in practice, or they've been in school all day, or they've been at home doing various things, and then they come and see me, and then they've got all these other things, and I need them to be present with me so that we can focus on what they need to work on. And so this is very important. Some athletes could identify that right now I'm having a thought that I can't pass this ball, and that's something that they could be thinking about out there on the court. Rather than reflecting on an objective truth, they could see this as just a thought. This is just a thought. It doesn't necessarily mean that I can't. So some of the athletes, because again, a mental health professional, I incorporate dialectics. Like, I can be anxious and I can still perform at a high level. So with dialectics, both can be true. You can still be anxious and you can still perform at a high level. So oftentimes that's part of that reframing that I use, and I incorporate that with the mindfulness to help athletes understand that both can be true and it's okay. And then emotional regulation, right? So this is the ability for athletes to exert control over their own emotional state. And oftentimes it involves rethinking and challenging situations to reduce their anxiety and stress. And this is where when they're out there, their teammates are trying to calm them down, and they're saying, hey, it's going to be okay. And with this is where most athletes really have a difficult time managing their emotions, because they're afraid they're going to get pulled out of the game. They're afraid they're going to be sitting the bench. They're afraid they're going to let their teammates down. And so this fear is causing that release of cortisol, which is causing them to actually make more and more and more mistakes. And so this is how they get to that point where they are just making mistakes after mistakes after mistakes. And so many athletes struggle with the basic emotional regulation, and knowing how to regulate your emotions during performance is extremely important. And so it is the automatic and deliberate use of certain strategies to maintain or modify or display emotions in a given situation. And so just because we feel a certain way doesn't necessarily mean that we have to act a certain way. Just because we feel fear doesn't mean that we have to perform fear. And so those are some things that I work with a lot of gymnasts when they have to do those, the back handspring or those more difficult skills. The first thing they're like is that I'm afraid. And so because I'm afraid, that means I'm going to fall. And so we call that emotional reasoning. And so I teach them that just because something feels a certain way doesn't necessarily mean it is so. And so we look at different ways in reframing that thought or reframing that how they're feeling. And so one of the things is, strategies for managing their emotions. Again, this is kind of ways in which I work with each athlete to kind of help them with some of those physiological responses. And we use a lot of deep breathing techniques. We use a lot of progressive muscle relaxation. We use a lot of techniques to kind of help reduce their anxiety so that they're able to focus, regulate, and then change that emotion from the inside out. All righty, so just kind of wrapping it all up at this point. So again, psychological skills training is one of the most effective strategies used in both elite and Olympic athletes, and it is often incorporates those 4 primary skills, which is imagery, goal setting, positive self-talk, and relaxation. And each of those are broken down into different phases. And then during the 4th quarter phase is where we actually employ or use these skills in practice and competition. So this is just kind of next as a sample of kind of how I use this. So one is I was working with a setter, a 14-year-old setter volleyball player. One of her fears was one of the things her coach said, she lacks communication, meaning that she wouldn't call for help when she needed help. And one of them was fear of upsetting her players by being a captain of the team. And she focused on negative past performances, and she lacked confidence when trying to set the ball across court. And so one of the things we did was doing the initial assessment and intake. Again, I use certain sports anxiety tests called the SCAT. I often use the Trait Sports Confidence Inventory Scale, and I use the psychological skills training for sports anxiety and assessment, as well as the athlete coping skills inventory to assess their psychological skills. And with that, kind of helps me figure out where I need to go. But one of the first things I am assessing for, again, is pathology. Is there a really true deep mental health component? Or is this psychological skills? Or is this just performance anxiety? And then we work on week 2 where the athlete and the parents are given that information. We discuss exactly those scales that we've used, where she has scored high in, where she needed some work in. And so we began to incorporate during individual sessions a lot of those things that needed to be strengthened. Particularly with this athlete, it was increasing her confidence by changing her thought pattern. And so her thought pattern was something that needed to be changed because she thought so negatively about everything out there on the court that it affected her ability to perform, and it affected her relationships with her teammates. So we worked on cognitive reframing. We worked on detoxing those negative thoughts using various skills, as I've mentioned before. And then we get to the acquisition phase where we actually start incorporating that in her practices. And then we get to the observation phase where I actually see her and observe her on the court, incorporating a lot of that. And one of the things that she used a lot was self-talk and setting goals. And so we worked on setting goals cross court. 5 out of 8 times she had to set it across court. And we worked on positive self-talk while she was doing that. And one of the things that she used a lot was, I can set cross court. So that was just like a basic thing she would say to herself. And that actually created that motivation, and it created that drive. And so she began to set cross court with no issues and no problems. And so we began to do that in practice. And then during competitions, we began to incorporate that in her competitions as well. And so again, I am Dr. Griffin. My company is Fourth Quarter Performance Consultants. I am a performance psychologist and a licensed clinical social worker. You can reach me, or if you need any advice or would like for me to work with your athletes, or would like for me to come in and do a consultation with you or the coaches or even parents, you can go to my website at fourthquarterperformanceconsultants.com. And there, for some reason, my number is cut off on the screen, but the number I can be reached is, let me see if there's I think I had there it is. The number is 623-328-8214. And so if you have any questions, if you have any further concerns, or just need some clarifications, I can be reached either via email at angelatgriffin@hotmail.com, either phone, or you can go to my website. On my website, there is a link where you can actually put questions in, and it will send me an email, and then I will get back with you. So thank you again for listening in. And that is all I have, unless we have any questions. All right, if no questions, thank you again for attending.